So without further ado, Anthony Boutard.
Thanks for coming out. With my wife, Carol, I own and manage Ayers Creek Farm. We're about 35 miles due west of here in the Wapato Valley. It's about 144 acres. As you'll notice, I love numbers here and there, and to buy a farm that's actually a square. 112 by 12. It's wonderful. The only thing better would have been a prime number, because I really love prime numbers, but there weren't any available at the time, but there was a square. We, over the years, have increasingly started producing our own seed on the farm, and that's where when Michelle asked me what I'd like to talk about, I thought, well, let's discuss this. And it's a little bit broader than just seed, and I don't want to limit it to that, and we'll go through the slides, and the slides will be my organizing principle. I just want to sort of begin with, this is the season for the seed catalog. Many of you are getting them. On our farm, we buy a lot of seed, a crap load of seed. We spend a lot of money on it. We produce our own seed, and I call it seed production because we don't simply save seed. And I don't like that term. Seed saving sort of assumes that you put something in a piggy bank and you take it out, and there's no sort of active involvement. If you're producing seed, it's an active decision-making process. And if you deny that, you'll end up being moribund, and in fact, sort of ruining this wonderful legacy that all these wonderful anonymous people going back at least 10 millennia have given us. So, seed keeping is really taking care and tending just as much as animal husbandry is taking care of animals and thinking about the genetics. And that sort of thing. So I'm going to begin with the seed catalog. Actually, the seed houses started, probably the oldest is Vilmorin. Vilmorin Andrew, which is turned into just simply Vilmorin Seeds. It was located in Paris and then moved around, originally in Paris. It started in 1742. About a short time after that, several seed companies started up in the Americas, in the colonies. One of the early ones was Landreth Seeds. It's still in business. They're headquartered, I think, still in Philadelphia. Every so often, things get bought up and moved around. One of the great pleasures I have is reading old magazines, and this is an old magazine. It's a bound collection of the American Agriculturist, and this is from 1876, so it was a centennial year, and there's a beautiful picture of the centennial building somewhere here. Just this huge palace, and later on you can come down and look at it, dedicated to American agriculture. It was a huge place, and outside, in Philadelphia, there's still mountains, and there's no suburbs, and probably not a lot of people around there at that point. But it's 100 years old. The country is 100 years old and is celebrating its anniversary. And if you go through, you will find lots and lots of seed advertisements. And there's sort of this wonderful energy. They were bringing seed over from Europe. Vilmorin was selling seed to the United States. And there were potatoes, sweet potatoes, cane seeds, everything's in here. And also a lot of good advice about how to manage your garden. And so, we have this sort of ancient attachment to the seed catalog. And by then already Gregory and a lot of the companies were sending out seed catalogs. Burpees was already in existence. Morton Farms, which later turned into Harris Seeds. When I was growing up, Harris Seeds, because I lived on the East Coast, Harris Seed and Stokes Seeds were the two most important seed companies we dealt with because they were very regionalized. Harris Seed Company was out of upstate New York. Stokes was just across the border in Canada. And those two seed companies dealt with northern seed varieties, and I grew up in Stockbridge, Massachusetts, middle New England. And so you bought those seeds. If you bought something from Burpees was from Pennsylvania, they tended not to be as reliable as those from Harris Seed. So there was a strong bias towards that. So we developed this wonderful mixture of seed companies and seed catalogs. Just want to acknowledge that because there are true masters out there. There are people who are doing incredible work. Oregon today is a very important seed producing area, and I'm going to talk a little bit about Oregon. I've got some slides that will sort of organize and keep me on track. Put sort of a little bit of Oregon's history. This is McDowell Bag Company. Wherever you have seed production or grain production, you have bag merchants. And this is the last remaining bag merchant down on the east side. McDowell Bag Company. They're on Madison. You can go in there. I bought this cool bag. This is a dense cotton bag from there. It's used, so they recycle all these old bags, and they have stacks and bales of them. And you can get them in thin cotton. You can get them in woven nylon. You can get them. This is a heavier cotton. I'm sure they have linen bags as well, and they all have different purposes. These are very tightly woven so the seeds don't fall out. They also have flour bags that have sizing in them to prevent the flour from oozing forth. And it's kind of neat. It's a last bit, so if you're driving around down on Madison, 80th is really underneath the Hawthorne Bridge. You get the shaking of the trucks going over the bridge. After a while, you go, what's going on here? We can go to the next slide. Yeah, there's a stack of these bags. Those are new. So they have both new and used. And there's beautiful little hand trucks. They're made out of a beautiful dark wood, an oak or something, maybe mahogany. They're ancient and worn out. And that's sort of the history, this gritty history of Portland down there on the waterfront. Next. Oregon's big seed growing area. We grow specific types of seed. This is a field of coriander, or what's sometimes called cilantro. This is just outside of Brownsville. So when I go down to, we make preserves down at Sweet Creek Foods in Elmira. I can go either left or right down the valley. It's kind of fun. So when I bring our fruit down, this summer I went down on the left side, on the east side of the valley, through Brownsville, and then came back up on the west side because I knew it was the height of seed season. So this is probably about an 80-acre field of cilantro seed that'll produce, and when you drive by it, you can smell it. And just a little bit to the north of there, I couldn't stop because with traffic. There was a beautiful big field of winter squash as well, kabocha type, that was for seed as well. This is actually our neighbors. This is right bordering our farm. This is a field of red Detroit beets. Red Detroit is an old open pollinated variety. It's been around for probably 50, 60 years, maybe longer. I don't know how many people, somebody may be familiar with it, but it's a wonderful old variety. It's being grown for Vikram Seeds, which is a Danish seed company. And what you'll know in the valley is there are all these foreign seed companies. There'll be Dutch. Beho Seeds is a good example. There are English, there are Canadian firms, there are firms out of India, and they're representatives of there, and they all grow different types of seeds. So our neighbors were approached, and when I saw the seed there, I go, boy, I saw the whole thing, and I think beets, and I'm going, oh crap, because these guys don't care about GMOs. So I thought, oh no, they're going to plant GMO sugar beets because there's a lot of sugar beet production in our valley. And I have to bear that in mind when I'm saving seed and thinking about seed, particularly chard and spinach, because it's windborne, and that's why Frank Morton, a lot of people are concerned about the GMO seed. So I looked and I went up to them and I talked to Jerry Van Nowland, who is the seed rep, and I started, just sort of teasing out what's going on, and he said, "Oh no, don't worry, Anthony. I know what you're thinking. This is going to be Detroit red sugar beets open pollinated, so you can relax." I relaxed and started chatting with them and watching them plant them. It's interesting, and because it's open pollinated, they're male and female intermingled. You don't have to worry about it. With the hybrids, we'll see there's a little bit of a difference in the planting plan. We can go to the next slide. We're a hotbed of seed production. This is just down the road from me. This is French breakfast radish. And you can see a beautiful field when we see these seed fields out in bloom. And we'll go to the next slide quickly. And this is kind of a wonderful system that they developed. They planted perennial ryegrass in between the rows of radish, because the radish needs lots of room. It's got these big heads. The grass will grow up, and it's deep-rooted. Both are deep-rooted. And now they have this, it looks like a turf. It looks like a stinking golf course out there. I'm not big on grass seed, but it shows how, the creative energy that goes into this. This farmer was really happy when that worked. But the radish, you can see the roots of the radish behind. That's a French breakfast radish, a standard open pollinated French breakfast radish. And they got a beautiful seed crop out of it. So we can go to the next. This is the beginning of a couple slides on hybrid seed production. And I thought I'd just go into, just very briefly introduce the concept of hybrids. Hybrids are when you have two varieties, very well characterized varieties that are crossed. It's not like a lot of, traditional science, biology, you often talk about hybrids being between two different species. The mule is a good example. It's between a donkey and a horse. This is a hybrid really between two varieties. It's what they call interspecific, the same species, similar varieties, but what you do is you characterize the two. Sometimes there are disease resistance and other factors that you want to have mixed. And in this case, you'll see there are 3 rows, and this is very characteristic of hybrid spinach beets. And I think there are 13 or 12 rows of the seed-bearing plants. So the 3 rows you can see, that lighter band, those are the pollen-bearing plants. So spinach, beets, chard are, and sweet corn, above all corn, are, they have, no, not corn, spinach, beets, and chard. Corn is a different thing. Have both male and female, separate male and female plants. And you can separate them out. You could do it by sizing the seed. And then they'll cross-pollinate it. They're wind-pollinated, so you got to sort of figure out how to do that. That's why they have this pattern, this alternating pattern of 12 or 13 rows followed by 3 rows of pollen-bearing plants. This is a field of hybrid cabbage. Cabbage, once again, they'll hybridize it. Carol and I went down to do our preserves. We noticed there was this beautiful field of cabbage planted, and it was growing. And and this was in November of 2010. When I went down this summer to deliver some berries to Sweet Creek Foods, actually on the way home, this is late in the afternoon, I noticed that they were staked, and I didn't have my camera, and I was kicking myself. So I got home, and then I had to go down a few days later to meet Paul for something else. And when I came back, they'd taken down the stakes, but you can see the stakes there. They staked up all the flowers. The hybrid cabbage, they've developed a line of male sterile cabbages, so that they don't produce any pollen. So when you plant a pollen-bearing selected variety there among them, you'll get a hybrid. Hybrids are neat. They're structured. They're engineered. A lot of farmers object to them because you can't save the seed. It's kind of a structural proprietary plant. But at the same time, it's a creative effort, and the farmer takes, whoever produces the hybrid seed, often they're university researchers. They've spent a long time figuring out the genetics and characteristics of the inbred lines. And so those inbred lines, they will mix and match. And an inbred line is simply a line of a group of plants that are genetically as identical to each other as possible. And so hybrids, there's nothing evil about hybrids other than those of us who would like to plant, replant seed can't do it. They're sort of a creative effort of a lot of growers. Increasingly, in organic production, organic seeds are becoming available. I'm always ambivalent about it because whatever, we do a lot of seed production, but I just wanted to cover what's involved here. We can go to the next slide. Now I'm going to talk about seed production. New varieties occur because of mutations. This is a mutation where the plant's not producing sufficient chlorophyll. no chlorophyll actually. It's what they call a deleterious mutation. I've got a few of these that are chlorophyll-free because they really do a good job of illustrating a trait that you can get from the plant. So this is a seedling that has that. It's a spontaneous mutation. It's out in the field. With beans, because they self-pollinate, you can perpetuate that mutation if you wanted to, but it's going to die on you because it happens to be lethal, deleterious. If it's a beneficial mutation, there's some, and very good example are in the squashes or in the cucumbers. The original breeders of cucumbers and squashes, if you taste a wild cucumber or squash, it is unpleasantly bitter. So bitter that it's close to toxic, and some people react very badly to it. And you can get that in cucumbers. That gene is sitting there, and it's usually quiescent, but every so often rears its ugly head. That happened to us this year with a whole field of cucumbers, and they turned bitter on us, and about 90% were bitter, 10% weren't, but you can't go and sample cucumbers before selling them. But that's an example of a trait that you can taste, but you can't see. So I just want to show one. We can go to the next one. This is another one. This is a pretty little corn seedling. This, once again, it doesn't have the chlorophyll. Chlorophyll hasn't, actually, it probably has chlorophyll, but it hasn't completed the construction of chlorophyll, which needs a magnesium molecule stuck up in the middle of the molecule, and if the magnesium doesn't get there, it turns yellow, and it's just a transfer because everything else was green. We can go to the next one. This one's kind of fun because this is what they call a sport. Once again, a chlorophyll defect, but this is on a grapevine, spontaneous mutation out in my vineyard. The popular table grape called Price, and it's missing the chlorophyll just on one branch. So you can get these chimera or sports, and that's where a lot of apples come from. Somebody goes out and they see this one branch, and it has really good different apples, and they're bigger or they're greener or they're redder. The other way you can get apples is you can grow a seedling and find a seedling that's particularly good. Typically those go by the name Pippin. And Pippin or Bramley seedling, Cox's orange Pippin. When he says Pippin, it was a chance seedling that somebody found. Sports, I believe Red Delicious was a sport. I believe it was a branch on a tree. So you can have sports or seedlings. And so that's where you get new varieties of woody plants, looking and keeping an eye. This is what farmers do really well if they're paying attention, and one of the reasons why you should consider growing your own things. And I don't know what I'm going to do with this. I keep that branch on there. I've got a few people who are interested in it. We may try to experiment with it. It'd be interesting to see what will happen from it. But it's very beautiful. And it's a pink grape, but the grape sucks. So it's not even close to edible, but it's pretty. It would go nice in a display if you weren't eating them. Sort of in a movie about Julius Caesar or something. We can go to the next one. Well, this is how you perpetuate those sports. You graft them. In my hand is the rootstock, and I've done a simple whip graft, no tongue. I leave the tongue out. Too much work. But just a whip graft and 2 buds. We will wrap those. That tree now is about 8 feet high. Is 4 years old. It's doing nicely. It's a very fast way to grow. What we do is, in the next slide, I put them in a bucket. This was advice of my neighbor who grows the apple rootstock for these. And jam it full of sand, throw it in the basement for about a month to 6 weeks, during which time in the dark, dank atmosphere of the basement, the callus grows. And it's about 60, 50 degrees under there, the callus grows. And the callus is what's repairing that graft. And we have here Alice Doyle, who actually is an expert. If anybody wants to talk to her, she's right there on tomato grafting. Alice does thousands and thousands and thousands of tomato grafts every year, and they're grafting rootstock, doing a similar thing we're doing here. And they put it, instead of the basement, they put it in actually a warm chamber, a moist chamber, and they put it in there. I think it's for 3 days, right? 2 to 3 days. And what's amazing, after 2 or 3 days, the callus has started, the process of reconnecting all the vascular tissue starts. Bang, 3 days, and it's all there. New growth. It's not going to fix the old part that was cut. It's just going to grow new stuff on the outside and repair everything, get all the plumbing back in order, and you've got a viable plant that actually combines the benefits of the root and the top stalk. So that's another thing, and it's sort of cutting edge what Alice is doing. So you can snag her later on. And she's also doing it with eggplants and I think peppers as well. Yeah. And then you can also get a tomato plant that will produce all sorts of tomatoes on the same plant, which I think is stupid. Next, waste of time. These are our sweet potato tubers. This is one of the reasons we do our own plant production on the farm. When we started sweet potato production, there were just 2 varieties mostly, Beauregard and Georgia Jet, that were available commercially. There were a couple others that Vardaman and I think you could get, but none of them were certified organic. We're a certified organic operation. I needed to do it. Glenn Drowns of Sandhill Preservation Center has about 200 varieties of sweet potatoes that he maintains. And he's certified organic, but you only get 5 slips. 5 slips will give you about 3 pounds of sweet potatoes. Not exactly a promising start if you want to go out and sell them. But that's where we had to start. So we started by buying 30 different varieties the first year. So I got all his shortest season ones. We planted them. Some survived, some didn't. There were different factors. One was soil. We planted them out, and some of them hit our clay soil and just went and became mushrooms. They flattened out, nasty-looking things. Others are the unstable moisture in our soil because it's got a lot of clay. It moves around a bit, cause splitting. But eventually we got some very good ones. These are selections. There's a purple, there's Ibis white in here. There's a variety that I can't remember the name of, and I was going to look it up just before I came here, from Maryland. It's a nice one, kind of a little bit starchier. Some of these are very spicy. The flavors are extraordinary. It's a tropical plant, and what's amazing about the tubers, there's this separation between the American and the Eurasian roots, and it's a big, huge separation. All the American Eurasian roots are grown from seeds that winter biennials. Virtually all of the American, I'm sure somebody could come up with one that isn't, but just keep it down. But as a rule, all of the American roots are tubers. They're perennial structures, and they're kept from year to year to year. And I believe, and my theory is that the reason is that there were 2 different forms of agriculture. They both started about the same time. That's what's amazing. About 10,000 years ago, we get agriculture mostly in India. I guess, while I let other people worry about where it started, Pakistan and also the Fertile Crescent. So it's bubbling up all over. I don't subscribe to the single origin. In the Americas, it was mostly Central America, Oaxaca, but there's some inklings that there was also agriculture developing in what's now the United States as well. And what's striking is this unity, and it has to do with, my view is that in the Americas, the farmers or the people growing the cultivators did not have draft animals or steel. Everything was done by hand and by stone or wood. So there's a very, very different, it's a very tactile group of plants. So the tomato, and beans, and so you're not going to get lentil type things. You get a little bit of that quinoa, which is a pain. I don't know why that's ever evolved in Americas, but as a general rule, you get these 2 different types of agriculture delivering us 2 different types of plants. So corn is a very tactile grain, whereas barley, the little dinky things, you'd need about 100 heads of barley to make a single ear of corn, the equivalent grain mass. But it's because with a scythe, you can do a lot more than with simple hand. And so you get these two different types of agriculture forming. Yeah, in the Americas, the other thing is that we were, this early agriculture all the way up until actually quite recently was Sweden-based, what people call slash and burn. So or shifting cultivation, which I prefer, or Sweden, no, shifting cultivation. So what happened was they would let land, it was not slash and burn constantly going out into a new area. What it was a cycle, a rotation of agricultural endeavor, where you would let your land, particularly in Central America where it was quite dry, you would let your land go back to a shrubby mix. You would use those plants to bring up nutrients, minerals. A lot of those plants, if you go down to Oaxaca, and I haven't been down to Oaxaca, but I've seen pictures, and my staff bring me pictures all the time, you will see a lot of legumes. And the legumes are nitrogen fixers. So you leave that sort of shrubby, ungainly mix, depending upon the circumstances, between 5 and 10 years. And you cultivate another patch. And then you come in, you slash it, you break it down, you burn it very quickly, a low fire, but you burn off you burn it so as to kill off the vegetation. The carbon stays in the soil. The root traces stay in the soil with their nutrients. And you got this pulse of minerals from the ash. And this pulse of minerals is good for about 4 years. Then you move on, and so you've got to have a series of compartments. It's more land intensive than a lot of agriculture, but it's interesting if you look. When the first tobacco growers came over, the saltweed factor was 7:1. You needed 7 acres per acre of tobacco you actually had in production, because tobacco was so hard on the ground that it took 7 years to recover. Allowed the soil to sort of shake off the effects of tobacco. It takes people about as long too, I guess. Nicotine patches and all the other things notwithstanding. We can go to the next page. This is a slip production. We put the slips in. We keep them over the winter. Then we plant them into a box, into these are just regular gray picking boxes, sort of a gray FYB. And we put some potting mix over, and then they will shoot up their slips. And we get about 15, 20, depending upon the variety, you may get 30 slips from each plant. Those are then cut off. We put them back into potting mix for a few days, and then we plant them out. Probably that last little detail is not necessary, but they always seem to recover better. It's the only plant that we actually use plastic culture on. We actually use a green IRT because they need some heat. But that's how we maintain our stock. So we're constantly reselecting, looking at the tubers. And as I said, it's a very tactile. It's one way to get to know your crop, and that's one of the great satisfactions of actually doing your own seed or producing your own tubers. You really get to know your plants. And plus you get to grow stuff that nobody else can grow, because you're perpetuating it, and it's gradually adapting to your soil and climate. You don't really think of it that way, but that's what's happening. We can go to the next slide. I also want to talk about a lot of tactile stuff. This is big tactile. This is iron tactile. And I wanted to talk about, this is what happens when two varieties of the same plant evolve together. This is a super jack, Pixwell super jack, harvesting green beans, quote unquote blue lake bullshit. It's this tough bean, and it's got to go into that hopper. So it goes through the machine, and you can see the beans. Actually, if it was clear, you would actually see the individual beans bumping up into the hopper. So they go flying through that machine. The plant is cut. It's got to have all the leaves stripped off of it, mechanically stripped off. They spew the leaves out, and this bean goes flying over there, lands in that hopper, and then if it's first in line, it's got several hundred beans lying above it, thousands of beans lying above it. So it's about 6 feet under beans. And then then they dump this into a big, huge belly dump or some sort of dump truck. And that dump truck's about 8 feet deep. And then they load that up, and then they drive it down to the cannery down in this case, Salem, I think. This was up near Dayton. They drive it down to same trip coming back. It was a very good trip. They'll drive it down to Salem, and they'll dump it into another hopper, and it'll go on a belt and go into the processor. That requires a really, really stinking tough bean. And they actually took the genes, the toughening genes from beans that typically use dry. And that's one of the reasons why we never grow bush beans for green beans. We grow a few for dry beans, but the bush beans, they never ever match the flavor, because anything that can take that sort of abuse, it's kind of like the Cornish cross and chickens. We can go to the next slide. This is my idea of a bean. That's Preacher being picked by the gentle hands of one of our staff, who happens to be here tonight. That's how beans should be picked. And when you have beans like that, they're tender, they melt in your mouth, they're like butter, you don't have to have a thick skin. They can be as temperamental and whiny and complaining as children. So that's a flip side, and that's a selection pressure. This is an example of selection pressure, and you know, green beans are a bit of a challenge because unfortunately they tend to self-pollinate. The other thing is they tend to outcross. We've had trouble with that. So if we're saving seed, if we're producing seed, the other thing is psychologically, when you're producing seed for something like a bean, you have to let a chunk of your row go to seed without touching it. You can't pick it, you can't look at it, you can't breathe on it, you got to stay away from it, you got to strip it off, because what you're doing if you start harvesting it is you're already selecting the best pods off those plants, and you're going to hammer the plants that have the best pods, the highest production, and you're not going to be able to evaluate what you're doing. And not only that, the seeds that come in later, and we have this problem with tomatoes too, and I'll talk a little bit about tomatoes later, the seeds that come in later are not as viable and not as good. They've got all sorts of genetic problems because they're the runts of the litter, sorry. For the person that's the 14th in their family, I apologize, but at the end of the line for bean at least, the plant's no longer investing a whole lot in that plant. It's had its run, and the other thing is there's more outcrossing as the plant ages. And this is just a factor of nutrients. What's happening is the plant's using up nutrients. So what it does is it opens up for pollen from another plant. You know, so this is sort of teleological explanation, hoping that that plant has a bit better nutrients or that they can sort of mix and match, so that you get that that effect. So when you're producing, sometimes when you're producing seed, this is a big collision for food producers. You got to say, oh, I'm not going to touch that. The same happens with turnips. If you want to produce seed for turnips, if you want to produce seed for rutabagas, tomatoes, peppers, you got to rope off your best stuff, and you got to preserve your best stuff, even with the sweet potatoes. Those sweet potatoes are far better than anything Stan and Michelle will buy at the market next week or in 2 weeks' time, and they know it. But that keeps our life, our stock going in the best possible genetic condition. We can go to the next. As I said, many plants are self-pollinating. This is wheat, soft white wheat. They self-pollinate. They will send out stamens, but by the time those stamens pop out, the deed is done. The sex act has been consummated. They don't really care, and in fact, there's not a whole lot of pollen. And I think perhaps it's even as those things are squeezing out that the pollen is released inside. But wheat is a self-pollinating variety. You can cross-pollinate wheat. And there are very, very dedicated individuals that are selecting varieties and cross-pollinating varieties of wheat in order to develop disease resistance, and that's something you have to constantly do. particularly as we have huge acreages of the same variety. It's happened in the valley. And fortunately, the one variety we grow is resistant to striped rust, so I just keep my head down, don't say anything, and cross my fingers, hope that year after year we'll still be getting wheat. We used to grow durum for Africa, and that succumbed to the striped rust. I've still got a bunch of seed. Maybe in 10 years' time I'll try growing it again, and maybe the striped rust will have evolved into a new demon and will ignore the durum. But anyways, wheat self-pollinating, very easy to perpetuate. So if you want to carry out some wheat production on your property, it's easy to do. Next, this is actually what we do for threshing small quantities when we first plant. You start out, in this case, we started out, it's a black type of barley, we started out with 200 seeds. It's a standard seed saver quantity. It's a sufficiently robust genetic population that you got the diversity. You plant 200 seeds, you go down, ding, 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 ding. You harvest about 50 or 60 heads ultimately because the mice get the others. And then this is the second year. And by the time we have enough to sell 1 pound bags at the farmer's market, we've been growing it out for 5 years. That represents kind of one of those bags about 3 years if you started with 200 seeds. So often people come up to me and say, well, why is your barley so expensive? Don't you have bulk? And I go, God, I've been sitting around scraping this on a screen for 5 years. Leave me alone. And then, keeping it pure, we had the grand hopes of having 3 or 4 different varieties of barley going at once. We realized that we can't keep it genetically clean, so we're growing 1 variety a year, and we're going to just leapfrog. You learn, and by mistakes, there are plenty to make. So this is barley, fairly straightforward to grow and harvest. We can go to the next. Corn's amazing. Corn's my love of my life, except for Carol. Corn it's just this amazing plant. It's this outlandish grass. It carries its pollen-bearing flowers high on the plant as the tassel. It's a particular flower type called a panicle. It's an open, sort of flowing, beautiful thing. In this case, this is a beautiful garnet red flower with the yellow stamens. Corn sheds its pollen early in the morning. Usually by 9 or 10 o'clock, it's pretty much finished the deed. You get out, the best time to get out and see them opening up is around 5, 6 in the morning, just as the sun's coming up. It's in the still of the morning. Although it's quote-unquote wind-pollinated, it's really zephyr-pollinated. It's just little tiny puffs it's just those little gusts you get in the morning, very early morning, that move the pollen around. And that's what you want in the cornfield. Because they're pollinating neighboring plants. Typically, the tassel flowers initially come out ahead of the ears. So these are those are the stamens. We can go to the next one. These are the stigmas. That's corn silk seed pollen resting on all the silks. The pollen will flow off of another plant, land. The pollen tube germinates, and what a journey. It goes down depending upon the size of ear, somewhere between 6 and 12 inches. That pollen, which is a 2-cell plant, one of the cells forms a pollen tube. Goes all the way down into a single kernel, which is not yet a kernel, into a single ovule, and then the sperm cell swims down behind it. And so you get this elongated plant, just one single cell plant. It's 12 inches long. It's going down into growing down into where the egg is. It's fertilized. There are actually 2 sperm cells. The second sperm cell actually fertilizes or forms a union with a couple other cells of the seed-bearing plant that will produce the endosperm. All that other stuff that's in a corn kernel. And I'm not going to get too deep into corn kernels but it's a fruit. It's actually a fruit. But we can go to the next one. For all those fans of Gianna Bernardini, who is now This is Roy's Callus Flint corn. She is now a baker. She was at Nostrana. She's now a baker in Calais, Vermont. And she wrote to me and said, hey, you know, I hadn't made the connection until I was reading your newsletter one day, and I'm going to Calais, Vermont, where your corn came from. So she's working there. She selected this last spring. She was helping us out with things. And I decided I needed a second eye, a second hand. This is sort of the artistic side of seed production. I said, Gianna, you need to go and start selecting the seeds. So it'll have just a slightly different twist. It'll have the Bernardini collection. This was a 2010 Bernardini collection. So sort of its own fashion statement. So the corn was slightly different this year. It's Gianna. Okay, next. Every so often I plant out what I call the corn romper room. It's where the pollen can go wherever it wants, and there's mixed. This is about 6 different varieties of corn that have pollinized this year. And I'm actually going to start working with this only because I like some of it. I like the fact that I've got a yellow kernel in there. The blue kernels are kind of standard. Then there's a speckled, kind of a robin's egg speckled. You see a couple of those. That's from a Peruvian variety from way up there in the mountains, Cusco. So it's, and we grew it just on a lark. I had some customers who brought me a handful of seeds, and they said, aren't these pretty? These are from Cusco. And I'm like, okay. So we planted them out, and then they actually did bear some ears, a couple of ears. Cusco, don't forget, is at the, it's tropical. It's tropical at 3,500 meters high. So it's close to the equator. I can't remember, but it's within the tropics. And so it's got the wrong sunlight regime and everything else. But somehow I managed to hang on. So what we're going to do is we're going to play around, because I'd like to have these little robin egg speckled kernels. I think that would be a neat, maybe some yellow, some, you know, this is what you can do when you produce your own seed. You can set aside part of your garden or part of your farm to do funky stuff and select out. None of it will impress maybe other people in your life, but that's life. We'll go to the next. This is another project we've been working on. I've been interested in growing pumpkin seeds for eating. These are naked pumpkin seeds. They're hulless. They are an Austrian variety. There was a spontaneous mutation in Austria that created, the Austrians grew a lot of pumpkins because they make pumpkin seed oil. They're big on pumpkin seed oil. They love this stuff. They put it in soup, they put it in salads, they put it in biscuits, everything. Wherever they can put pumpkin seed oil, they'll put it. We'll leave it at that. But cacti is one of the naked ones. Lady Godiva is another variety. There are several varieties that were brought back to the United States. I think in the 40s or 30s. This happened in the early 20th or late 19th century, that they had this mutation. And what's nice is you can eat the seeds right out of the pumpkin. The problem is the seed stock I got from High Mowing Seeds was poorly grown. And you get this, and this is one of the biggest frustrations I have with seed, particularly at the moment from the organic seed houses. The quality, the selection is crap. And you get all these off types, and you get, except for in the hybrids, it's better. And this is one of the reasons why a lot of organic growers are going with the hybrids. The open pollinated, they don't have the experience and the careful hand in the field. Unfortunately, with pumpkin seeds, you can harvest these mechanically. They have a big machine. They go out there and just pump them, and they use water, and they spray everything around, and they get all the seeds out. So it's very easy to harvest them without going out and selecting them individually. On the left is a beautiful one, a dark, nice, tight seeds. Cavity is well organized. There's nothing like a well organized cavity, as any dentist will tell you. On the right is a mess. And these are, the one on the right actually was a bigger pumpkin and should have had a higher number of seeds. It didn't, it had fewer. There were a lot of these split seeds, and what happens is they're starting to germinate. It's kind of this weird Oedipal thing. They're starting to grow inside the mother. And they turn intensely bitter because they start producing the bitter element that pumpkins have in them. And they're inedible or unpleasant. while the other ones are sweet and nutty and oily and have a very rich flavor. So next year, what we'll be doing is, this year I didn't have them isolated enough to produce seed, but what we're going to do is we're going to produce seed. We're going to plant probably about 200 or 300 of these pumpkins, and we're going to just select out the very, very best. We're going to sit there, open them up, taste them, look at them, see how easily they come out of the pumpkin, because some will come out and they're a sticky mess. And I don't know if any of you have grown pumpkin for this sort of hulless pumpkin, but some are a mess. They're a disaster. Others come out and you just pull them out and they're just like they should be put into a plastic bag and sold at the store. So working that out and moving through is, one of our goals next year. So it's one of the things you can do when you're producing your own seed. And often it's out of necessity that you have to do that. Because otherwise we'll never grow pumpkin seeds, and I won't have the perfect pozole, which is from our corn, our own cilantro and all that other stuff. Anyway, we're going to next. We had the same thing happen with gillfeather, which is a white rutabaga. It was a complete disaster. And not only that, they ran out of seed. So as soon as I fell in love with it one year, they didn't have any more. And it's this really exceptional white rutabaga. So that was a case where we had to actually produce our own seed in order. Fortunately, I went out and the seed catalog came and they said, out of stock. And I went, oh. And so I had to run out and rope off our row where we had some still standing, not the ones that I would have saved if I was producing seed. But we did that, and then I had to wipe out all the kale because they cross-pollinate, and all the cabbages, because it's actually rutabaga is a hybrid between a turnip and a cabbage. So we had to sort of eliminate all those other flowers on the farm in order to produce seed, and it worked quite well. Every so often you get a real purple one, and I think that's from the Ragged Jack, from the red kale, the red Russian red ursa, one of those red kales that we get out of Frank Morton. It sort of every so often insinuates itself into the rutabagas, but it hasn't done any harm. We can go to the next. This is another project. This is in the third year. We started having trouble with the borlotti beans that we've been growing. And there was a virus in them. And there were two things. There was a virus, and then there was all these off types. And this was seed that I got directly from Italy. Had it shipped in through my seed merchant. And I said, I really want fresh, good seed from Italy, direct from the field, because I'm having these weird problems. We got them, and there were all these off types. Some of the pods were, 8 beans in. Some had 3 to 4. Others were big, others were small, some were purple, some were black. It was just a mess. And so what we've done is we've spent the last 3 years reconstructing the variety. Borlotta Le Mans is an exceptional Borlotta bean, but you only want to have 3 or 4 beans per pod. And if you have those big long ones, which have 7 or 8, which are sort of the commercial standard, the quality of a bean drops. It's not investing its full oomph into that pod. And the other thing is you want a very specific shape pod and stuff, so we went back through and we've sort of been teasing it out. And I'm hoping next year we'll do one more selection, but we'll have more more beans to sell. But that's what you end up having to do. This is the only company where we could get that bean type. And so you can nudge them back, and you can do it very, very fast. It's amazing. 3 to 5 years, you can get a variety shifted substantially in a different direction. You just got to know what you want and be very clear about it. And that's one of the things, that's why I talk about seed production rather than seed saving, because it's always a question of making a decision. I want to have this, or getting Gianna to do that decision too. That's kind of fun to have somebody else do it once you've got things sort of stable enough and you know what you want. But deciding this is a type of plant I want. This is a healthy plant. This is a good-looking fruit. In the case of the squash, we'll be tasting them. We want high oil. We want a nutty flavor, going through, and then you can. I'm hoping 4 to 5 years to have a very stable, good quality cacti squash back in our farm. This is one of the tools we use. This is a little clipper seed cleaner. This is where you kind of have to constantly change, and you actually have a couple screens. One's on top is called the scalping screen. The one on the bottom is called the sieving screen. And you run your seed through and it cleans it. It blows off all the extraneous stuff. You can use it to size seed. If you make a mistake and you mix 2 types of beans, as long as you remember to mix your beans, so you do small bean, large bean, small bean, large bean. If you make a mistake and get some mixed up, you can always separate them out using the seed cleaner because it also sizes and sorts. It's not quite as good as sort of the Cadillac of seed handling equipment, the gravity table, which we all lust for, but it's not in, I don't think in my cards, at least, it's too expensive. It's a heavy, pricey machine. But it does allow you to separate, on how heavy it is, and a little bit gives you that notch up for the person who's really serious about growing out seed. We can go to the next. I think this is the last. Yeah, this is the tomatoes. This is Astiana. One of the things we've been working with is this tomato from Italy. I've been disappointed with the paste tomatoes that we've had available in the seed catalogs. If the tomato is not adapted to the area, sometimes you get this odd metallic flavor. Slicing tomatoes are not good for sauce. This is a very, very dry tomato with very few seeds. And in fact, if you go through, and this is kind of one of the phenomena I was talking about, the first tomatoes have almost no seeds, and those are the ones which we use for seed production. So we go through, because those are the ones that haven't yet cross-pollinated. What happens with tomatoes, they're a heavy feeder. The early ones are self-pollinated. People always say they're self-pollinated, but the early tomatoes are always self-pollinated. And so you get very, very few. You may get a dozen seeds in a tomato. As you come into September, late September, suddenly you've got 200 or 300 seeds inside the tomato. You know there's hanky-panky going on. It's having a good time. It's breeding like crazy. Free and easy, and don't save those seeds. That's something, if anybody's interested in saving seeds in tomatoes, that's my advice. Get the first crop that comes off and select them very, very carefully, keeping an eye on diseases and other things. But this makes a great sauce, and the reason we chose it is, well, we actually tasted a sauce made from it. It was astounding. It was in October in Italy, and this thing was a field-grown tomato from that region. And that's told us, this was in the Piedmont, 45th parallel. That's the same parallel as we are. So it's in the right place. One of the big, I think most of you have heard me say this, your latitude is probably more important in developing a good seed variety for your area. Find a seed from that latitude is more important than climate. I think many growers have this experience with Japanese seeds. If you grow Japanese varieties, particularly for winter greens, they'll often bolt, and that's because there's the only part of Japan where you're at 45th parallel is Hokkaido, Sapporo. Far north. It's stinking island, way above any part of Japan. Most of the Japanese vegetables come from down along the 35th, 32nd parallel. So, their internal clock, their light regime is very different. Lights for a lot of plants, particularly for brassicas, well, for onions, corn, is one of the key determining factors in whether the plant survives flowers. Okay, I'm going to leave it at that. I do want to mention, I did bring a couple books, Seed to Seed. I didn't get into all the technical stuff, but there are a couple good ones. This one is Carol Deppe. She lives down in Philomath, I think, or Corvallis, or someplace down there in this far southern Oregon. And then this is Seed to Seed by Suzanne Ashworth, also a very good book. These are very useful when you're dealing with a specific plant. I didn't get into all the details, but I will stress before closing, if you're producing seed in order to save money, forget it. It's time, energy, and I hope you'll get appreciation for that. Time, energy, money that goes into seed production. You'll never save money by growing your own seed, producing your own seed. You will have better vegetables, better quality plants if you do it well. If you just simply take the seed and put it in a mason jar and put it up on the shelf, I mean, you're wasting, I think you're wasting your time, and you'll eventually run down your variety. Seeds and varieties need to be constantly maintained, constantly evaluated, and it's kind of like kids or something. Anyway, I'll leave it at that. If there are questions.